Okay, okay, are you listening? Yes, I think you are. So, let's re-begin our program. And as you could see, there's lots of information, even in the previous classes, that I pointed out, but certainly you still have some doubts about it, and that's why you do have all those papers that were delivered to you, and you can kind of read them. And if you have any questions and further questions, you can then mail me your questions or your queries about bibliography, about the specific questions you might have. I would like to finish this course, because this is unfortunately our last session, precisely taking to the fore one aspect that is not usually treated or dealt with when we make the history of colonization or the history of the overseas expansion, namely the Portuguese case, which is the role of women in all that process. And dealing with this, because usually you take it as acquired that this is a man business, because they are sailors, because they are merchants, because they are the politicians, but in fact no society is implemented and without obviously the presence and the role and the protagonism of women, except frequently it's harder to, in the sources, to catch and to apprehend and to be really able to identify the role of those women. In terms of the study and the focus of this question, which I've been working with for some years already, we can focus it by several ways. Here in this class, we are going mostly to speak about the role of the Portuguese women in this process. But you have a paper that is among the ones that were delivered to you, which is called Women as Go-Betweens in the East, in Portuguese state of India, 1500, 1600, which gives you the other perspective of it. Since the paper was published, I thought it would be more interesting for you, for me to present the data on the Portuguese women, the Portuguese society, and the Portuguese women also in overseas. So the other paper, Women as Go-Betweens, they focus on the role of the local women that perform exactly as go-betweens, that establish connections between worlds. When I deal with this topic, the women on the Portuguese expansion, and I stress that I'm going mainly to focus on the Portuguese women, I make a division on women who go and women who stay. Because in fact you have those that are involved, that are embarked on the ships and go to overseas, and then you have the ones that stayed in the Portuguese communities. And at the first session we had, I said that this concept of globalization, of connecting worlds, has reciprocal effects. There are not only the Europeans that are going to transform or to interact and to project themselves in the other worlds, there are the other worlds and the experience of the overseas expansion that affects also the Portuguese society. And this is one of the main aspects in which it can be acknowledged. The role of women was transformed also because of the Portuguese overseas expansion. That's why we have also to focus on women who stay. Among those who go abroad, women on the move, we are going to talk to women on board of ships, women as agents of colonizations, and their presence and roles overseas. Among the women who stay, we are going to focus on transformation, on the demographic context and the demographic system imposed by the absence of men that go abroad and go overseas, transformations in family context, in labor market, and in socio-economic context. So this is our script. Let's begin with the idea of women on board. First of all, it was a kind of a taboo speaking about the women on board, because obviously we think the crews, they are male crews. There are not women on board. But obviously there were women on board, because if they were colonizers, if they were going to Africa and to Brazil, and if they came to the east, obviously that those women had to be on board of ships. But so it was inevitable, their presence on board. It was the only way for them to arrive to overseas settlements. But the fact is that when we go to legislation or to the ruling, what we see is it is forbidden. Women are not allowed unless they have the specific authorization of the king or the king officers to go abroad. So they could only be on board with the crown consent, or those that were forced by the central power, what we call the orphans of the king. We are going to talk about it in a minute. They were orphans, and the king would marry them overseas, but then they were forced to go to overseas to marry. And there are some circumstances in which we are going also to try to explain that even the prostitutes were agents of colonization, and the crown itself would send these women to perform some kind of sexual roles within those communities, mostly of men. Those are then the ones that are either come with crown consent, and you can imagine that if it is a governor or a captain or a viceroy that comes, his wife has authorization and consent of the king to come. So there's the ones that come with the consent. If you are speaking about nuns, about religious women, they come with the crown consent. So those, they come as well with the crown, not only consent, but they are forced to migrate. But then you have a huge number of clandestine women that are identified on board. Some of them are prostitutes, some of them are adventurers, some of them come searching for their family men, for their family agents. So, summing up, women on board, their presence were exceptional. If we come and read the legislation, it should be exceptional. It was punished, as we are going to see, and it is very difficult to evaluate their real presence, because most of them were clandestine, because we don't have sources really to identify and counting them and trying to know how many women would embark to the Indian Run, which was the rate of women. So under registration and clandestinity, through these three factors, make it very difficult, I wouldn't say impossible, but very difficult evaluation of the presence of those women on board. So the norm says it is forbidden. Women cannot, by rule, go on board. It should be avoided, but the fact is that it was inevitable and constant. Just to give you a hint, just to give you an example of this kind of norm and punishment, this was a printed order of Vasco da Gama itself, and it should be posted on the places of embarkment and on the carracks itself, and would say that any woman who has to be found on board of the Cape Run ships without royal permission would be publicly flogged and banished to one of the hunting grounds of Africa, even though she was married. Her husband would be in irons and forced to return to Portugal, and the captains of the ships that did not surrender to the competent authorities would lose their salaries. And this is at the beginning of the navigations to the Cape route, the Cape Run. It was in 1502, 1503. We don't have exact dates. And obviously, when you have a rule that forbids, that's because it was a practice that was there that had to be forbidden. So usually norms and rules and law, they don't prevent inexistent situations. They act over the existent realities. So we could imagine that all this would happen. And as you can see, never mind if they're married, they will be punished anyway, and their husbands will be punished, and the captains of the ships would be punished if they didn't have a royal permission to be on board. It goes along with the idea that I stressed here yesterday, that the Crown tried really to control the Cape Run, and only the one that were authorized to be on board and be transferred to the east, and namely to India, should board on those ships. But obviously the reality was another one. And in fact, many women were taken on royal ships and vessels with the knowledge and consent of the captains and commanders themselves. In fact, they used to receive money for it and to hidden those women on board. And that's what precisely says a letter of the Bishop Fernando that was in Goa in 1542, and he says, many women were taken on the royal ships and vessels with the knowledge and, and he says, that's what I say, and so His Majesty will be served if the captains do not bring in their ships and galleons single women, as they do, as the matters of war and places where they are claim for virtuous works and for confessions, rather than to get involved with them, which is the cause for some ships being lost as they are. So, women as the cause of tranquility, of problems on board with the seafarers and the crew, and would make the ships go lost. We have other statements. We are saying that we lack sources. Yes, we do. We lack statistic sources. We lack sources that can measure their presence on board. But we have qualitative data and statements that clearly certify that they were on board and they were clandestinely on board. Those two letters are from Jesuit priests. And so this from Sebastião Gonçalves, he says, the first day of the travel from Lisbon, we seek to put out the poison that the devil often introduces to the destruction of the seafarers. So we put out two suspicious women. Another one says, other three women were on board without a breadwinner husband or anything of good, one of which in a habit of men. We imprisoned them under lock and key, making them a thick box for this purpose. And so we put it in work, giving the key to a faithful person and fearful of God, that at certain times gave them something to eat and opened them for some needs. So we can imagine that this condition of women that were put into a box during months of navigation. And obviously you know the logistics of the Carracks. The Carracks didn't have cameras except for the pilot, the captain itself, eventually to some family, and sometimes they would improvise and make some cameras on board. So it was a kind of a public space that was used by the crew, and the cameras, the rooms were just a few. So when they could, they would let them in Africa, in the grounds of Africa, as they say. But sometimes when they discovered their presence on board and they could not just stop over, they would bring them along, but with all this kind of restrictions. And there is even a chronicle which is very hard to read, I have to say. Even an historian, we have to be a kind of objective reading things, in which describes that in Goa arrived a ship that brought some of those women. And Vasco da Gama publicly flushed them almost to death. And then before he died, and in his will, he gave some money to those women as a kind of guilty because he has done to them, but he stressed that he had to give the example. What means that really this was a trend, and this was a trend that the Portuguese wanted to prevent, which is very strange when we think that you don't make colonization without settlement. And if you want settlement, you need obviously men and wives. And this was the rationale of the Spanish colonization and settlement in the Americas. Okay? It was exactly the opposite. The man could not be away more than 3 years. After that time, he should return home, or he should be obliged by law to return. They didn't return anyway, but by law, it was exactly the opposite. Either your wife goes along and joins you in Americas, or you have to return to the king. As we can see here, the Portuguese policy is quite different. And that is why we have to understand also the policy of the casados, the married men in Goa and in the state of India, according to which the marriage, or at least the formal connections and the consolidation of relationship with local women, would be further the solution put forward by the Portuguese colonizers, rather than bringing from Portugal the women to colonize these spaces. The two solutions, obviously, they went side by side, as we are going to see. But anyway, we can see here a clear differentiation relating to. But obviously, we have also to consider that one thing is traveling for 2 months and arrive to the Americas. The other thing is traveling to 9, 10 months and arrive to the East and Far East. Anyway, there is no explanation because there's no systematic law on that in terms of the Portuguese law. But it is clear that this kind of control of the Portuguese women on board is responsible also for models of settlement and colonization that depended on the local women and implemented the marriage between the Portuguese and the local. And that obviously was also responsible for the establishment of networks and the idea that the local women really were very important intermediaries. Were these marriages with the consent of women? Mostly no, because most of those women to which the Portuguese men would marry, they were Christianized of their will or forcefully. Some of them were Muslim that were captured by war, and then they were forcefully Christianized, and then they would marry with the Portuguese. So, but the intermingle existed anyway. And this is really responsible to the patterns that we are talking here about the connection between worlds. Because, as you can imagine, marriage and having children and settle down implies that you share your culture, your language, your home, your material culture, your family. So it is really a way of connecting worlds and women performing as intermediaries between worlds. Okay, here it's like Portuguese. I'm just going to summarize it briefly. It is a law from the 18th century, and it is a law from the 18th century that refers to transportation of women from the Azores to, in fact, from Madeira to Brazil. And they were trying to colonize Brazil with more Portuguese population. So they were bringing families, entire families, from the archipelagos, from the, well, since the water is here, I think I can, from the Atlantic archipelagos to Brazil. So even in 1747, what it says here is that the women has to be taken with all the honesty. And they have to be enclosed in cameras, closed cameras, and closed with a key. And a man should be taken a kind of control, and no men were allowed to enter those cameras except the priests or a doctor in an emergency case. It says also that those women only could get out of that very small camera to go to Mass at Sundays. And at Mass, there should be the altar, and then there was the officers, the women, and after the women, the clergymen, the men of family, and then the soldiers, and then the crew. Okay, so there was this huge distance between the seafarers and those women. And those were clearly, I underline this idea, family women. Was not those that they say they are adventurers or single women. Or so, obviously those women were the ones that were going to improve the Portuguese settlement, or make it available, make it possible, the Portuguese settlement away. Family women, and then the king's orphans, we are going to talk them about, but also the prostitutes or ex-prostitutes. Again, we are going to talk about. So the condition of those women is that some of them would be enclosed. They would be a kind of prescribed to very narrow spaces. They would be kept, even in overseas settlements, they would be kept. They wouldn't really interfere with an active life. And sometimes, on the contrary, they were active protagonists in economy, in politics, and in society. So, if we want now to talk about the presence of those women in overseas settlements, we have obviously to understand what we have said 2 sessions ago. It's totally different if we are speaking about Morocco, or if we are speaking about Brazil, or if we are speaking about the Indian Ocean, because the overall conditions are different, and the roles that are expected from them, and the capacity that they have to be absorbed or interfere with those society, and climates, because frequently we forget that the geomorphology and the climate is a very important condition for all of this, or determinants. So we cannot have one single model of settlement or one single model of women in those settlements. It is different on Morocco, which sometimes were war zones, when the cities were kept by war. The Atlantic Islands, Madeira and Azores, that was uninhabited. So it was just the transportation of the Portuguese family cells to those agrarian economies. The African archipelagos, which I spoke already about the Africanization, because there were not enough Portuguese women, white women, to colonize these archipelagos, Cape Verde and Saint Tomé. So it was mostly African women that were going there. Or if we were talking about West Africa, where the presence of Portuguese women were minimal and exceptional, at least until the second half of the 16th century. Or Brazil, where the number of Portuguese women were clearly increased, and the Indian Ocean, for which policy we have already spoke about. So the distance, the political and economic framework, the climate and the geomorphology would interfere in different strategies and trends in what concerns the presence of women in overseas settlements. And there we go again to this suggestive dispersion of the Portuguese settlement all over the world. And obviously we just cannot imagine that the situation was the same in Brazil or was the same in Japan, in which the presence of the Portuguese women is not even foreseen. In fact, it was not even foreseen the presence of any kind of Portuguese except for trading, and trading in Nagasaki in a very specific position. Even so, there are documents, namely, when there is the edict of expulsion of all the Portuguese from Japan, it says explicitly the Portuguese should go to be expelled from the territory, but their wives and children, Japanese one, they should stay. What means that even if Portuguese settlers should not have been in Japan territory, except for the Jesuits missionaries, the fact is that they would have married there and have also their families. Anyway, so the conditions were quite different, and as far as the Far East, there was obviously a significant number of Portuguese women in Macau, even if in Macau the partners of the Portuguese were mainly Chinese women. Not only of the Portuguese, and I'm talking about partners because some of them were married, they were Christianized, and then they would marry, but some of them were not married. But their children were legitimized by the Portuguese and were taken inheritance of the Portuguese wealth. And this difference is quite important because I talked to you about misericordias, the confraternities, that used to make social support to the populations, or precisely in Macau, they would also take the Chinese partners of the Portuguese, because obviously those confraternities would take care of the Portuguese and not really of the local populations, except they would take care of the children of the Portuguese and their wives or partners, being them local women as they were, namely the Chinese women. So this is a big world, and there are very different schemes of adaptation and the presence of the women, Portuguese women overseas. So, but anyway, when we try to identify some of their performances, they were certainly family pivot. They were central elements of the family and to constitute a family. They were economic partners, and sometimes very important ones. They were political administrative agents, and they were demographic agents because obviously they were the base of the European family settlement. This is very important, the oligarchic connections through marriage. What I want to say, I will do it with some examples. This is all over the world, obviously. Frequently, you establish connections and networks through marriage. You choose a bride, you choose a groom, you choose someone that matches in order to implement the connections of a family, of a business company. So the women, they are key elements in all these strategies. And we can see that in Brazil, for instance. We can see that clearly. And in Brazil, the intermingle with the local women or even the slave women was extremely active. So you have frequently crioulas, women, girls that were child from the Portuguese men. They were legitimized by their parents, and they were very wealthy. Except they didn't have status, and frequently the parents didn't have status, either social status. They were wealthy, sometimes their color was not white, but they had obviously wealth enough. So what happens is that the parents try to marry them with people with noble titles, not aristocracy in the sense of blood aristocracy. We are not talking about counts or dukes, but we are talking of people that are from the low ranks of the nobility that have no money. And so there is this association between those younger sons of the noble family in Portugal with the lower status and the wealthy girls, daughters of wealthy merchants or landlords. So the oligarchies overseas, they are built on this basis of multi-racism, multicultural, and social promotion and social mobility. So we can see that in Brazil, and we can see clearly that in São Tomé. And in São Tomé, what you have, I've said it before, is that in the beginning of the 16th century, and during all the 15th, but mostly in the 16th century, the elites, they were Creole elites. And then they the oligarchy, and even under the pressure of the representatives of Portuguese crown, trying to marry those girls with white men coming from Portugal in order to go and whiten those oligarchies, those elites. But in fact, and again, marriage and the role of women was absolutely essential for us to understand the profile, the social and the economic profile. In Saint Tomé, I don't know if I'm going specifically speaking about this. Yes, I can talk a little bit about this. In Saint Tomé, this is quite interesting because besides this Africanization process that I was mentioning, the miscegenation with free black women, so it brings us to the Criollo in terms of ethnicity, language, and culture. There is a very interesting pattern because the Portuguese women that were there, they were very powerful and they were very wealthy. And a Portuguese historian, Arlindo Caldeira, who is an expert on that field, tries to explain that and says that when they come to Saint Tomé, we're talking about the Ecuador. We are talking about diseases, we are talking about mosquitoes, we are talking about rain forests, we're talking about all the adverse conditions for any European that is not prepared to resist to that. So those women usually were protected at home with, from mosquitoes, from the climate and so forth, so they usually survived their husbands. So what you have is Portuguese women, widows, very, very wealthy. And frequently they choose their next marriage or they choose not to marry. And they were very wealthy landlords, yes, landwoman properties. And they have really real power over Saint Tomé, for instance. And we have some cases of that in Brazil as well, as we can see. So basically, as Charles Boxer says, the relative scarcity or the total absence of white women in some territories resulted in the fact that barrier of color were largely ignored. The barrier of color was largely ignored in Brazil, in Saint Tomé, and in a great extent also in the East and Far East, even if, as we know, and it is stated in the letters of Afonso de Albuquerque, they preferred to promote the marriage of the Portuguese with the elites also of the Goa society and not the Goa, the Eastern society, and they reflect it also in terms of the color of the skin. Okay, this I'm not going to in detail, but it is another way of putting women serving the Portuguese settlements. I spoke about the presence in Africa and the presence of the Portuguese in the region of Elmina, the zone of the gold exploitation, not really exploitation, because the Portuguese didn't make gold exploitation in Africa. They would buy the gold to the local merchants and then create a monopoly to bring it to Portugal. It's a very detailed description of how they would prevent any agents just to touch the gold dust. But the fact is that for that, they would avoid the presence of the Portuguese for many years. So those was going, for instance, 25 persons for 3 years. They were chosen by the king officers, and among those, it would go 3, 4, or 5 women that have very specific tasks to perform. They are described. This is the regulation of the factor and the captain of Mina. And it is well described that they should make bread, they should make laundry, they should make some kind of nursery when needed, but it is also stated that they should perform acts also, they should be available, sexually speaking, for those men, in order to keep them within the castle of Mina and not let them interfere with the local communities, because any kind of contact in that case would lead to smuggling of gold. So in this case, the king pays, and the king pays, and each one of the men that should interact with these women should pay them a fixed amount, and so they were performing a role. But they were performing a role, in this case a sexual role, besides all the other nursing and cooking and the laundry and all that, which was essential to keep stability of this settlement and this establishment. So we have also, if we go through the chronicles, we have also news of the interference of women and war. For instance, in the siege of Diu, Francisco de Andrade, he talks about women that would be on the back of the battle, helping with the not the death, but the wanted people, but also preparing weapons too. And we see that also in Morocco, in the siege of Ceuta, for instance, or in the Argila ones. So we can see that these women, being there, they would perform as that were needed, and performing also in acts of war. The more detailed data we have about the performance of those women are, in fact, in Brazil. And in Brazil, we have lots of examples that are more detailed. But all these, you see, we call it in Portuguese, dona. The Mrs., so dona is a status. All of those were a kind of noble women, one way or the other. But we are going to talk about the others. But at least those ones, they are well studied and we can document their importance in terms of settlement. So you have Dona Ana Pimentel, wife of Martim Afonso de Souza, that was governor of the captaincy of São Vicente. She was provided in the captaincy in 1538 for 10 years. So you have women that are captains, they are the owners, they have the jurisdiction, they take care of the high-level power in those captaincies. You have Dona Brites de Albuquerque. She was herself governor of Pernambuco after her husband's death. You have Dona Isabel de Lima. She was administrator of the captaincy of Santo Amaro. You have Ana de Sande, Lady of the Queen. She was captain of Porto Seguro. You have Luísa de Andrade. She had the possession of plantations and sugar mills in Pernambuco. You have those who were entitled with sesmarias, which means properties under their exploration, the concession of huge extensions of land to be exploited, namely as sugar plantations. You have those who fought French corsairs or Dutch invaders. They are presented as heroes because they, in the absence of men, they would themselves organize and fight the corsairs that were arriving to the Brazilian coast. You have this example of Dona Inês de Souza. She was the wife of Salvador Correia de Sá, also a governor, and in 1583 she organized a military company of women to fight French corsairs. Obviously, when we say it is a military company, it is a self-organized company, obviously, of women, but with a strategy, and they were really able to, at least this time, to put the French corsairs away. And you have this a kind of archetypical example of Clara Camarão, Dona Clara Camarão. Dona Clara Camarão was a Indian woman. She was the daughter of an Indian chief, the chief of a tribe, the leader of a tribe. And she was well known because she came to Europe. She went even to Paris. She was extremely beautiful and she was well educated. And so it is full details. That it's not a biography, but we can bring details and data here and there. And she was really leader of an Amazon squadron in Guararapes battle against the Dutch. There was two main battles against the Dutch, the Guararapes battles, because the Dutch were in Brazil from They were tried first to settle in Bahia in 1522, but they were kind of expelled by the Portuguese and the Spanish, but they settled in Pernambuco between 1530 and 1554. During that time, they ruled Olinda and the part of the Pernambuco captaincy. And they were really then, I mean, there was some resistance and adaptation, because this is another example in which, during the Dutch rule, the Portuguese didn't disappear, obviously. So those who used to produce sugar, they kept producing sugar and selling them to the trade networks of the Dutch. And same were the same, because by that time, and there we go again to the New Christians networks, lots of the Portuguese persecuted Jewish or New Christians went to Amsterdam. And they kept all that networks of trade with the Portuguese. So, in a great extent, the Dutch were able to settle in Brazil and to keep going with sugar production because of those networks of trade of the Portuguese New Christians or Jewish. When the Dutch formally were expelled from Pernambuco, some of the Dutch remained there. Some of them converted to Christianity or Catholicism. At least formally they did. So we have here different settlers. They were the Portuguese, then the Dutch came and for a while stood and dominated Pernambuco, and then we have the Portuguese again, and we have those networks of trade that remained in place, no matter who was the ruler. Obviously that when the ruler changed, the ones that were charged of cooperation with the enemy should be persecuted in some way, but the fact is that those networks would still in power. So this Dona Clara Camarão organized a squadron of women to fight the Dutch. So we keep going, trying to see the presence of Portuguese women in several overseas settlements, and we arrive to Goa. And in Goa, we have several testimonies, but let's select this one. Tavernier and Mandelsloh. Those were those travelers that Professor Radica mentioned when she said that there was those travelers that would come to the Portuguese possessions, would take notes, would take the information, and then would bring this information to Europe, and this information frequently was very useful for the rivals and of the Portuguese themselves, being them the French, being them the British, or the Dutch. So we are talking about Tavernier, the French. So he says, the Portuguese living in India are the most vengeful and jealous in the world. If they have the slightest suspicion about their wives, they get rid of them without the least scruple, with either poison or the knife. And then we have Mandelsloh, who says, you do not see many Portuguese of half-caste women wandering around. And we are talking half-caste women. Wandering around the city. And when they do go out, it is to church or to pay any visits they need. They are carried in closed litters or accompanied and watched by so many slaves that it is impossible to speak to them. So here you have the perspective, let's face it, of the elite society of Goa, and you have clearly this information. You are talking about the Portuguese and these half-caste women wandering around. So this is clearly the testimony that many of the women and the children of the Portuguese were resulting from those marriages of the Portuguese men with local women, and they were obviously treated as such. Let's face it that in what regards poison, the women usually use it much better than the men. It is one of the best ways. And when we studied crime all over the world, poison is one of the preferred weapons of women, let's face it. But that's okay. Here, there is this register and testimony of this. The fact is that we cannot, again, imagine that women were not present, and we can see them also here in Goa market, because obviously those would be safeguarded, would be kept at home, would be some surveillance over them, but they were economic actors as well. So we cannot just imagine them kept at home or just being yeah, but here, okay, I forgot, I didn't forget, I just didn't select the topic, but we can speak a little bit about those women that were forced to go. Because any kind of colonization has schemes of settlement. And women are part of it, and one of the ways is to use the orphans and to make them married overseas. The French did that a lot in Canada, in Newfoundland, Canada, for instance. And the Portuguese did as well, except the numbers. We have this book of Timothy Coates, which is called Degradates, Criminals and Orphans as Settlers in Portuguese Overseas Expansion. So Timothy Coates' book. And he studies precisely the number. He tries to identify the number of orphans that were used by the king, the Portuguese crown, for 2 centuries as agents of colonization. But in fact is that the numbers are not significant. This is the symbolic policy that to use those orphans of the king, but their numbers are not significant. The fact is that the king put those orphans, usually daughters of those that have died in fighting for the king or in traveling in overseas in favor of the king, and they would give them a dowry, and you would send them wherever, first for Goa, mostly for Goa, for the east, but also for Brazil, some of them, and also for Africa, namely Angola, when the number was not at all sufficient for the Portuguese settlement. I mean, we could speak hours just about this topic, because there is this idea that this is the ideal policy of the Portuguese crown, sending those virtuous orphans to the east and so forth. But the fact is that there are letters that come from Goa, from India, for instance, in 5040s, that said, please don't send more of those orphans. Please don't. Because here we have so many orphans of the Portuguese that we cannot marry anymore. So, and they explain other things which are very interesting, because those orphans of the king should be women of some status, social status. And the men that were on the market willing to marry, they were soldiers. They were seafarers. They were from a different status. So you could not marry those men that wanted to marry with those women with a social status that asked for other kind of a man. So this is a problem. The other problem is that they will say that they are already too old to marry. Because as you know, in these societies, the age and the conditions for being a mother, for the biological reproduction, implied young women. And some of those waited so long to be married, then they would not marry anymore. Because the idea of using them as breeders of Portuguese families didn't work anymore. And so they would become nuns. So they would be out of the market, of marriage market. Okay? So all of this is much more complex than we can imagine, and this is a kind of mythical idea that Afonso de Albuquerque promoted this policy of the married woman and the Portuguese, and it is, obviously, but it was not by decree that happened for decades. Because, I mean, even the viceroyalty of Afonso de Albuquerque was a short one. So, anyway, this is a complex matter, but I think I just call your attention for some topics that you should be aware and not reading the reality as if it was as simple as that. Okay, we have some questions about all this, and some questions that I'm not going in deep is at what extent this presence of Portuguese women in those territories created reciprocal influences. In what extent local women were affected by the behaviors or patterns of behaviors of the European women, and at what extent were the European women transformed in any way by the local status of women. Those questions are new questions, what means that we don't have answers to them because we didn't ask the documents and the sources enough questions about this. But one thing I tell you, those universities interacted, no doubt, not only in Goa, but mainly in Goa where we have more data, because we have lots of statements of the Jesuit priests forbidden them to interact with each other. So again, if they are forbidding them, it's because it happened, that kind of interaction. Okay? And namely, they were, for instance, forbidden Muslim women to attend the childbirth of the Portuguese. Because obviously a child, once she borns and she's in problems, life condition problems, it should be baptized. So no Muslim woman would baptize a child, one thing. The other thing is that they say that the women would say some words, some kind of prayer, something that should not be said because it was a Christian child. And because they think that creates a kind of ascendant over the child of the woman that gives birth to that child. But all this reasoning shows one thing. Portuguese women interacted and depended on the knowledge, on the help of. Other statements, they are more joyful because they say that Portuguese women used to attend the religious festivities of Hindu and Muslims, and they would even share jewelry and clothes, and they forbidden that, obviously, again, what shows that that kind of sociability would happen. So the question unanswered is, and I think it is a very interesting one for any one of us to think about it, how did it change patterns? And in some instances we know, for instance, divorce. Again, there is the ecclesiastic records that say Portuguese women are getting, the expression is crazy. They are asking for divorce because they are seeing that in some societies, for instance, Ethiopia, the women, the princes, the aristocratic women, they are able to ask for divorce. And they are Christians also, so they are asking us for divorce. So the degrees and the demands of divorce are greater and greater. So there are some signs that there is this interference of the local patterns. And then this is just an example that it is also forbidden. That's why I brought it. Okay, here, those are representations of Muslim Moors women in Grenada in 15th century. So in the 15th century, there was still the kingdom of Grenada was still on the control and the rule of the Moors, so Muslim population, and those are representations. But this one is a representation of São Paulo, Brazil, a Portuguese woman in the 18th century. And so the law begins to say it is forbidden. It is forbidden to hide their faces and to dress like the Muslim women. And it is strange because we would say, why would those women, Portuguese, dress like? And legislation explains because they do that not to show their face, because they are going to meet their lovers, or because they are committing crimes, or because they are living at night what they shouldn't. So they are using a pattern of another culture, which should be description, which should be, it's an ethos on this, that it is totally transformed for those women to hidden their faces and do whatever they want to do. But the fact is that they are using the same pattern of wearing and so. And obviously we have all kinds of ethnicity and culture and knowledge that is within Europe, by this mobility of people, namely slaves and free people, that is going to Portugal and interferes on the daily life. Not to speak about the African cultural presence in Americas, or the North America, the Central America, or in Brazil, which obviously transformed totally, and the Brazilian society is clearly a mix of the European, mostly the Portuguese, the African, and the Amerindian population. So this is a syncretic model. Okay, running against the time, we are now speaking a little bit, as I said, about the women as intermediaries in the East and Far East. Please take your time, but read the paper that was delivered to you, because I think that's their interesting hints. And we are trying now to produce a book on that topic, but that chapter is a short chapter that summarizes some of the role of the local women, which is as important, if not more, than the role of the Portuguese one. So now we are going to Portugal, and I'm going to make this question. How the navigation, trade, and immigration of males interfered with the performance of women, namely in terms of family context, demographic context, sorry, there is here a typo, labor cost, context, and socioeconomic context. Okay, labor context, labor markets. We have needs from an economy that needs more boats, more sails, more rope, more food, and in a universe in which men, they are getting away. They are getting away either because they are member crews. Oh, thank you, okay. Thank you, I have also here my water, thank you. Either they are member crews, or they are going away for all kinds of activities. Yesterday they asked us to, okay, all kinds of activities abroad. So what happened is that this market needs labor force, and this labor force is going to be performed by women. So they get more and more in the labor market because they need to replace the lack of men that are not anymore in Portugal. So what we see is really those women in shipbuilding industry, for instance, in the fabrics of sailing or rope or whatever, and it happens, it leads to the fact that the single women and the widows, they have greater opportunities for self-support, self-sufficiency, and the married women, they have greater participation in family income. So we are talking about labor, we are talking about work, we are talking about economy, but this is society which is involved. Why? Because obviously, in European society, as in most societies, you have, in these times I'm talking about, in 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th century, the idea that the destiny of women is to marry, of a woman is to marry. So marry is the natural destiny of those women. But it is not, or it is less and less in these kind of societies. First, for demographic reasons. You don't have enough men on the market. Because they die soon, because they are abroad, because they emigrate, because so the marriage market is unbalanced, and you have much more women than men. So no, there is no way that all the women can really marry because they don't have a husband. So you have a higher number of single women, and you have a higher number of widows because you have those men that die more and more because of the dangers of the sea, of or the tropical diseases, or of the wars, colonial wars, or the wars of the sea. So, and then you have those married women. And those married women, they stay alone and they have to take care of their family. And you remember that in the first sessions, first to the second, I think, we talked about the income of the seafarers and the wage of the seafarers, and we said that sometimes they were years waiting for the king to pay them their wage. So those women, they have to be self-sufficient. They really have to have money and contribute to breed their children, to raise their children. And you can see this more and more. So even the married women, they would contribute to the income of the family, and frequently they were the supporters of that family. And this obviously increases the female participation in the world of work, but increases obviously also the role of women in society. I bring you some numbers about Vila do Conde, which is a very, very small seaport northern Porto. And these numbers, what do they say? Those are registers, tax registers, okay? Of 1568 and 1643 are the dates. This is the total number of registers, contributors. Here, 115 are women, what means that 18% of the households that are contributing were of women. But here, and this is a much more expressive, because this was, cannot go into detail, this is just the ones that pay more. This is just one part of the society, okay? It's not a general tax. This is a general tax. And in this general tax, 43% of the households were led by women. Okay? It's not the same percentage of contribution. When we are going to measure how much they paid, they only paid at about 20% of the total tax. But in terms of being contributors, they were 43%, which is huge. So we can really imagine that, and they only are shown in the sources. They only are mentioned because their men, either they are dead or they are not there. So they become visible in the sources. Otherwise, the identification of the register would be led by the name of a man. So this guarantees them visibility, the absence of men. So we are talking about labor, and you were explaining that what happens in the labor market has everything to do with the demographic context. We are talking about male absences. We are talking about high premature death rate. So we are talking about less men in the global population, lower male rate. So we have, if you are not following me, please tell me, because I'm speaking too fast, because I have lots of information still to share with you. But if you are not following me, please tell me. I go slow or I go back and explain it again. Okay? So what we are now questioning is how the male absences interfere with the transformations in the local societies, and how did it affect the role of women in Portuguese societies. The data I'm bringing here and systematizing with the percentage and statistics and so, they are mostly from maritime communities, and mostly from that Vila do Conde case study, which was the subject of my PhD thesis. That kind of microhistory I talked to you about in the first session, saying that we come across different ways of studying the Portuguese overseas expansion, precisely because we leave the crown alone, we leave the central archives alone, because they have been dealt with for so many researchers in a very good way. Let's focus now in a different way of seeing things. So let's focus on the local. And when we focus on the local archives, it's when we get these conclusions that I'm bringing to you. That's why the methodology, the theory, interferes with methodology, and the methodology interferes, obviously, with the empirical results we are presenting you. Okay, so we are talking about lower male rates. Let's see if you understand each other. This is an average which is expected in European societies. When born, usually there are more boys than girls that are born. Statistically speaking, around what we call the ancien régime, the society until the late 18th century, this is the average. There are more male than female that are born. Okay, so this is the average, and usually it is even higher. So you can see that it is again Vila do Conde that I'm speaking about here. In an average, it happens, even if not really all the time. But then, when I'm going to measure the masculinity rate, I mean the number of men per the number of women that are dead in Vila do Conde, that die in that same place, what you see is that you go for rates of men dead that are lower, lower, and lower. It means that they are born in Vila do Conde, but they are dying. They have to die. We know that. So if they are not dying in Vila do Conde, they are dying away on the sea, overseas, in Lisbon, wherever. But they are going away. And it is even more striking if we think that in maritime societies, besides the ones that are born there are lots of men and women that comes from inland to the coast, because they are attracted by the opportunities that are given to them by these overseas expansions. Okay? So these rates are even more impressive. But the fact is that it is going to have consequences. And the consequences, as I said, is the high rate of single women. There are more and more single women that don't marry. The other one is the early widowhood. So the widows are very young. Sometimes they remarry, sometimes they don't remarry, again, because there are few men. And there is as well the increasing of the number of children per family. It is obvious. If a man is away for months or for years, if you have a monogamic marriage, you don't have children. Okay? So the intervals between the birth, they are bigger and bigger. So the number of children per family is smaller and smaller. So what we have here is this calculation. Again, this is statistics made from thousands of records. I've worked in my PhD thesis. So among the seafarers, the men of the sea, mostly there is only 1 to 2 children, because they are away. On the opposite, on those professions that there are inland, they are craftsmen, they are carpenters, they are whatever, they are farmers. On the opposite, you can see the rule is that you have 3 to 4 children, 5 to 6, 7 to 8, or even 9 to 10 or more than 10 children per family. Okay? So do you see the difference of pattern? Those are the seafarers. Those are the men that go to sea, and they have more than 65% of them only have 1 or 2 children. So the average here is 5 point something. The average here should be 1.8 or 2 children per family. What happens here is that frequently those children die, because the rate of the child death is very high. Still is in the societies we're talking about. What does it matter? It matters a lot, because the mother runs everything. And she doesn't, when the husband dies, she's a widow, and when the children frequently die, she is the only inheritor of every goods that are. So she's frequently a wealthy widow, and she becomes frequently the woman that runs the business of the family, because the husband dies or is away, and she has no children to keep going with the family business. And so they are really creditors, they lend money, they are running ships, they are merchants, And even sometimes when the children are alive, and I'm laughing a little bit because there are cases, when you make microhistory, it's fascinating because you go step by step and you know everything what those people were doing 500 years ago. So there is a story of a widow. Her husband was a very wealthy merchant. He was in Brazil, and he died in Brazil. And so she had 3 children, and the 3 were spread. One was in Canary Islands, Atlantic, the other was in Madeira, and the other was in Angola. And she took it very clear in a notary record that she would be the head of the company, and the children would do whatever she would tell them to do. So she had at least three male children that were businessmen, and she let it clear, I'm the main inheritor, I run the show. And it happens frequently with this woman that really became wealthy and interfered with this socioeconomic context. So those women really became much more notorious in the society and in the economy. So these results, in fact, I don't know if I have a table here. No, I don't have a table, and the table was pretty complex. What here is the result of the statistical analysis of some 4,560, I think, registers, notary registers. Okay? So I had to do that to my PhD thesis. I was not looking for women. I'm not oriented towards gender history. I was never. But it was impressive how these women just emerged from the documents, and they called the attention. Okay? So I tried to classify all kinds of acts in which they were performing in these notary acts. So I could see that they make financial investments, they were traders, they make all kinds of buying and selling, so asset transactions, they make collections of money, they were creditors, they were ship managers, they were contractors on shipbuilding industries, so from an economic point of view, but these social dynamics, they were equally important because they had the guardianship of their children when they were widows, and let's face it, by law, it was forbidden. It was clearly stated, though, no woman could be the guardian of the children. It had to be a man. But the fact is that they were. So they were, they have the guardianship of their children and the inheritance of the children. So they would run also the management of their money and of their goods and the real estate also. They made all kinds of endowments of their daughters, which is also extremely important because they decided to whom the daughters would marry. They would give the dowry, and they would, again, run, in social terms, the connections between families. They were releasing slaves, what means that they had slaves of their own, and frequently they released the slaves. They were administrators of goods, and I'm not going with this concept of chapels, because chapels is not the chapel in the term of a building, is the income and the goods that are attributed to a set of money and property that has to give income to pray masses for the soul of a person to the rest of the times until the eternity. So in order for you to take care of the soul of a person till the eternity, till the last day, you have to put real estate and income that would provide money to give the priests to say mass, processions, whatever. So this is a religious thing, but it is a very economic thing because you have the concentration of lots of goods that have to have administrators, and lots of those women were administrating those goods. Then we have them running also ransoms for their captives, husbands or sons, because obviously if you have piracy, if you have privateering, frequently they became captives, and they have to negotiate the ransom to get them back home. They were performing in court laws, and obviously they were present in those notarial deeds. So what we have here is an increase of women in public representation and in extremely extremely expressive visibility of women, and also, as we are going to see, increasing in alphabetization, knowing how to read and knowing how to write. Obviously, there is, as you know, quite a difference between alphabetization and literacy. So you can just write your name, so you are not an analphabet, you are alphabetized, you can. And the other thing is literacy. And the literacy is really when you can read, understand, make interpretation, produce your own texts, reproduce your own ideas. So let's make this differentiation. Those are all signatures of women of the 16th century Vila do Conde, which is a very, very, very small community. I'm not saying that all those have literacy or have high levels of literacy, but I can guarantee you that some of those, they ran their own account books. They wrote the accounts. Someone owns me such and such. I have to pay such and such. So they will run their own account books. Some of them wrote their own will. The last will, do you call it in other ways? The will. Okay. Some of them would write their own wills, and some of them left their own notes and books. So some of them really had some degree of literacy. The other ones make a point of signing themselves. They don't want any man to sign for them. And the notary used to say that sometimes. They didn't want the testimonies to sign for the witnesses to sign for them, so they signed their own name. This is very important from a social and social representation point of view. So I have at about 16 to 18% of these women that were identified on those notary records that make a point to sign and to write themselves, which is significant in terms of visibility. Okay, when I go and ask who were mostly those women, and again, I'm sorry, I put the wrong slide. This is in Portuguese. I have another in English. So, but you are going to believe me when I tell you that here there are seafarers, shipmasters, and pilots. Here there are merchants, and here there are craftsmen. So we can see craftsmen. We can see is that 75% of these women, they were connected. What means they were daughters, they were wives, or they were sisters of, or they were mothers of seafarers, shipmasters, and pilots. So the ones that were going abroad, traveling in this overseas Portuguese expansion. And then they were also merchants, obviously. So what I mean is that in this case, I departed from an hypothesis. And the hypothesis, in terms of scientific work, is a kind of a lever that pushes the way. What are you going to do to check this hypothesis? Okay, so the hypothesis was that the absence of men and inherent to this process of Portuguese maritime expansion had to have, or most probably had, repercussions, social, internal repercussions, including on the role of women. So I had to identify who were those women to know if, in fact, those women were the ones connected with those who were away and abroad. And in fact, the conclusions seems to, because you have here more than 84% of those women were really connected with those seamen. And to be noted, okay, 63% were widows, so we can say they were performing those acts because they didn't have husbands, they were alone, but 31% they were married. So they were doing that even having husbands. And probably in certain cases the husbands were away, and when they were not, they were make some statements that allow them also to run the business. Okay, I'm not going much further here, but I could go much further because it has much more other kinds of social implications. And that those implications, we can identify them and measure them in the Inquisition processes. As you know, the Inquisition, or not know because you're not obviously familiar with this, the Inquisition is ecclesiastic court. And the Inquisition was created in Portugal. It was first time in 1536, but then it was installed in 1540, 44, and mostly in 1564 in a definitive way. And for instance, in Goa, it was established in 1560, as I said before. So the Inquisition should mostly prosecute crimes of faith. Any deviation, any heterodox practice of the Catholic faith should be persecuted by that. But it evolved, as I said, Christianity or Christianism is not only a dogma or a doctrine, it's also an ethics, and it's also a pedagogy. So there are other crimes that are inherent to that. For instance, bigamy. For instance, prostitution. So there are lots of registers and proceedings of the Inquisition that deals with those problems. And the process of bigamy are maybe the most expressive related to what we are talking about. Bigamy produced, for instance, by men that were abroad and they had a family in Brazil and still had a family in Portugal, which was a crime, obviously, and they were persecuted. And the bigamy of women that frequently didn't know that their husbands were still alive after 18 years of absence and would marry or live with other men, and then suddenly the man would appear and said, I'm alive. So the woman became a bigamist, and she would be persecuted by that. So there are lots of other dimensions of this reality, and there is still, I only make a reference, not because it was expressive, but because it appears also in the documents, some interesting data on issues of sexuality. So we have denounce of people that are going to the inquisitors or to the priests to say that there were some of those women that would stay together while their men were abroad, and they would practice homosexuality. And the people that were denouncing would describe pretty clear what were those practices. I'm saying, and I'm underlining the idea that this is not the rule, this is the exception. But it is also expressive in terms of the daily life, in terms of sexual behaviors, in terms of the kind of familiarity that grows between women that stay, that it is also a dimension to be studied. It is not a rule, and the inquisitors didn't really proceed with that kind of accusation. They were much more worried about the practice of the Jewish or about our practices of heterodox doctrines or about witchcraft or whatever. But in fact is that it emerges in the documents. For me, the most important is to know, in terms of the daily life, that frequently those women, when alone, when they didn't have children, where their men were away, they would still and live together, even to protect themselves. And then in the 17th and mostly in the 18th century, which is interesting enough that the society became even more controlled and even more punishing of the deviating behaviors of the women, those men would go abroad and would leave them within monasteries, for instance, a kind of prisoners. They could not go away until the men were out. Okay, I'm just so trying to summarize all this, that I've been talking you about this course of navigation, trade, immigration. I've been talking about this Portuguese overseas expansion and these patterns of globalization. But these patterns of globalization have local impact. You can measure those impacts in those small communities, being it in India, being it in Southeast Asia, or being it in Portugal. And you can measure it in many dimensions. This is one of the dimensions I choose because it's not really well or deeply dealt with by the historiography. So it's just to call your attention for that, but I'm pretty sure that here you can find many, many fields in which this kind of research can be done. Okay, so I shut up now. It's already too late. And then after the break, we continue the presentations. Thank you. Thank you.